Hi, and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Introduction to Culture Studies, where we're looking at the final text for this course, which is Slavoj Zizek's Welcome to the Desert of the Real. So we saw in the opening lecture for this particular text, we saw how Zizek draws on a range of popular films, popular cinema, in terms of looking at how those can be connected discursively as well as stylistically to some of the real events in the political sphere. Now we just move on with that kind of analysis. This is page 14, which should be on the screen, where he makes a reference to the Hitchcock film called The Birds, which is one of the best films Hitchcock ever made. And Zizek is a big fan of Hitchcock because he does a lot of Lacanan reading of Hitchcock. If those who are interested in Zizek can find out, can dig up some of his readings of Hitchcock using Lacan. Very, very fresh and original readings. Now, in this particular section, it talks about how a scene in Hitchcock's Birds, when the first bird appears and hits the heroine of the film, as you know, the first bird appears as a blot in the sky and comes and becomes a bird and hits the heroine as she's approaching in a boat towards a lover's house. How that becomes an anticipation, in a certain sense, of the 9/11, the footage, 9/11 shot of all the planes coming and turning into big planes from little dots in the sky, and then causing this catastrophe in the white western space. And we saw in the previous lecture how the way in which the grammar in which the catastrophe was conveyed was quite spectacular and quite hyper-real. And it was like decaffeinated coffee. It took away the real catastrophic content. There are no dead bodies, there are no mangled bodies, there's no mangled flesh. And what we see instead is a hyper-real spectacle of a massive mansion destroyed, decimated by a couple of planes. And the way it's disseminated in the screen, it just seems to be a very postmodern film. So this is a reference to the Hitchcock film Bird, or Birds rather, that Zizek makes. It's not the endlessly repeated shot of the plane approaching and hitting the second World Trade Center tower of the real life version of the famous scene from Hitchcock's Birds, superbly analyzed by Raymond Bellow, in which Melanie, the heroine, approaches the Bodega Bay Pier after crossing the bay in a little boat. So Zizek is over here drawing on Raymond Bellow's analysis of the scene in Birds, where the heroine, Melanie, she gets on a board and moves towards the lover's house, and then she's attacked by a bird. And that particular scene in which she's attacked by a bird seems to be an anticipation of the massive spectacular scene in 9/11, where the two twin towers were attacked by a couple of planes. When, as she approaches the wharf, she waves to her future lover, a single bird first perceived to be as an indistinguished dark blot, and they appear, and she's attacked by the bird. Okay, now it unexpectedly enters the frame from the above right and hits her on the head. Was not the plane which hit the WTC tower literally the ultimate Hitchcockian plot, the anamorphic stain which denaturalized the idyllic, well-known New York landscape? Right, so the plane which hit the World Trade Center may be read in a similar kind of structural mechanism as a little blot which became a big bird, which then attacked the World Trade Center. And again, if we do a comparative analysis between Hitchcock's Birds and the World Trade Center event, we find what is happening is a de-domestication of reality. So both birds and planes are domestic entities, are domestic elements. What happens in Hitchcock's Birds is that suddenly the domestic entities, they become de-domesticated, they become denaturalized, they become wild. So a similar kind of a denaturalization happens in the World Trade Center event, 9/11 event, where a couple of planes which are perfectly domestic and naturalized entities, they become suddenly denaturalized and suddenly become uncanny. And the uncanny violence which is unleashed on the Twin Towers and become a spectacle of horror. Now, Zizek moves on to reference to the film Matrix, which is directed by the Wachowski brothers. It's a trilogy, but he talks about the first film. So the Wachowski brothers hit Matrix 1999, brought this logic to its climax. The material reality we all experience and see around us is a virtual one, generated by and coordinated by a gigantic megacomputer to which we all attach. When the hero, played by Keanu Reeves, awakens to real reality, he sees a desolate landscape littered with burnt-out ruins, what remains of Chicago after a global war. So the real reality and the virtual reality, they constantly blend in the film matrix. And the whole film becomes a very postmodern experience of reality, hyper-reality. So reality which is sucked out of its real content. And then when he wakes up to real reality, he finds this completely abandoned landscape of ruins, burnt out ruins, which is what is the remains of Chicago after a global war. The resistance leader, Morpheus, utters the ironic greeting, "Welcome to the desert of the real." You know, that's obviously the title of Zizek's book, but the point that he's making over here is when he wakes up to reality, real reality, it's like a desert, it's an abundant landscape, a liquidated landscape. And the liquidation of the landscape becomes a very important part of the reality. That's the real reality, so hence it's described as a desert. So welcome to the desert of the real becomes a very ironic greeting to the hero who wakes up to that. Was not something of a similar order that took place in New York on September 11. Its citizens were introduced to a desert of the real. For us, corrupted by Hollywood, the landscape and the shots of the collapsing towers could not but be reminiscent of the most breathtaking scenes on the big catastrophic productions. So this is what Zizek talks about from the very inception of this book, and that is the real horror, the real collapse of the Twin Towers in 9/11. They were reminiscent in a very important way and a very disturbing way of our consumption of catastrophic cinema, of our consumption of catastrophic movies, which have a similar kind of spectacle. And again, what we're seeing over here, what we're experiencing over here, is a blending of reality and virtuality. When you're watching a film, we're obviously talking about a production set, we're talking about an artificial set. But when you're talking about 9/11, these are real buildings which are collapsing, and yet the way, the grammar of consumption that we have, it blends the reality and the virtuality in a very disturbing kind of way. Okay, when we hear how the attacks were a totally unexpected shock, how the unimaginable, impossible happened, we should recall the other defining catastrophe from the beginning of the 20th century, the sinking of the Titanic. So again, the entire 9/11 attack may be seen as an instantiation of the impossible, the instantiation of the unimaginable happening, and that's something which is preceded in the Titanic situation. The sinking of the Titanic was an unimaginable occurrence, and that was the beginning of the 20th century. So Zizek is giving you a sequence of Western horrors, the Western catastrophe, sinking of Titanic, and then followed by 9/11. The sinking of the Titanic. This also was a shock, but a space for it had already been prepared in ideological fantasizing, since the Titanic was a symbol of the might of 19th century industrial civilization. Does not the same hold also for those attacks? These attacks, not only were the media bombarding us all the time with talk about the terrorist attack, terrorist threat, this threat was also obviously libidinally invested. Just remember the series of movies from Escape from New York to Independence Day. That is the rationale of the oft-mentioned association of the attacks with Hollywood disaster movies. The unthinkable, which happened, was the object of fantasy, so that in a way American got what they fantasized about, and that was the biggest surprise. So this is a very provocative statement, as you can understand by now, and that what Zizek is saying here is, before the 9/11 happened, there was a series of disaster movies which were often had similar kind of content: the collapse of America, invasion of America, attack of America. So from Independence Day to all kinds of cinema, Escape from New York, Independence Day. So all these movies were basically reliant on that kind of a content. America has been attacked by outsiders. The outsiders could be alien, the outsiders could be foreign nationals, etc. But in a way, America was fantastically prepared for 9/11, and I use the word fantastically prepared quite literally in terms of the fantasy that it was consuming libidinally in movie screen. It was prepared visually for the horror which really happened. So it was unthinkable. 9/11 was unthinkable because that was the object of fantasy, right? And the object of fantasy turned true, and therein lies the unimaginable quality. Therein lies the impossible quality of 9/11. It was impossible to imagine because it was fantasized, and what was fantasized was becoming real, and therein lied the horror. It was the horror of the fantastic sublime in a way. So the ultimate twist and this link between Hollywood and the war against terrorism occurred when the Pentagon decided to solicit the help of Hollywood. At the beginning of October 2001, the press reported that a group of Hollywood scenarists and directors specialists in catastrophic movies had been established at the instigation of the Pentagon with the aim of imagining imagining possible scenarios for terrorist attacks and how to fight them. So this becomes quite literally a blending of reality and virtuality. And we can see Pentagon, which is a real office, a real political office, military office, military intelligence office in the USA. It actually solicits helps from Hollywood directors, from Hollywood cinematographers, from Hollywood cameramen in terms of advising them to be better prepared against possible attacks. So Hollywood directors, Hollywood cameramen, Hollywood crew now team up with Pentagon officials in terms of preparing America more judiciously, more robustly, more muscularly against foreign attacks in future. So that becomes quite literally a blending of the reality and the virtuality situation that we've been talking about for a while now. Okay, and this interaction seemed to be ongoing. At the beginning of November 2001, there was a series of meetings between White House advisors and senior Hollywood executives with the aim of coordinating the war effort and establishing how Hollywood could help in the war against terrorism by getting the right ideological message across not only to Americans, but also to the Hollywood public around the globe. The ultimate empirical proof that Hollywood does in fact function as an ideological state apparatus. Now, if you look at this particular section, we're just coming out of Althusser, we're just coming out of Catherine Belsey's reading of Althusser, if you remember, and this is just an extension of that. So what Zizek is saying is quite provocative and quite, it's fascinating really. So he's saying essentially that post 9/11, the Pentagon officials, they solicited the help of Hollywood producers and directors and cinematographers in terms of preparing them technically against foreign attacks, against possible attacks in future. But not just that. What also happened post 9/11 was the White House consistently and constantly invited Hollywood producers and Hollywood directors in terms of its war against terrorism, in terms of advising Hollywood how to make movies which would propagate this war against terrorism message in a very literal and classical sensation of Hollywood becoming an ideological state apparatus, a classic ideological state apparatus, whereby it produces certain ideology, it disseminates certain ideology as a spectacle. And obviously Hollywood is a very powerful ISA, a very powerful apparatus, as you can imagine. So any movie coming out of Hollywood which has this war against terrorism motive will be disseminated and consumed by millions of people across the globe. So in that sense, it becomes a very effective instrument of ideology, and hence it becomes a natural example, a very extremely natural example of an ideological state apparatus. Okay, so this bit becomes very, very important in Zizek's analysis, and it goes on to say on the screen the fact that after September 11, the openings of many blockbuster movies, with scenes would bear a resemblance to the World Trade Center collapse, were postponed. Other films were even shelved. Should thus be read as a repression of the phantasmatic background responsible for the impact of WTC collapse. Of course, the point is not to play a pseudo-postmodern game of reducing the World Trade Center collapse to just another media spectacle, reading it as a catastrophic version of the snuff porno movies. The question we should ask ourselves as we stare at the TV screens of September 11 is simply, where have we already seen the same thing over and over again? All right. So as you can see, the massive spectacle of crisis, massive spectacle of destruction, of decimation, of terrorism, which we saw in 9/11, were reminiscent visually of our previous consumption of similar Hollywood movies. And as Zizek quickly points out, that movies which have similar openings were shelved or repressed after 9/11. So that kind of films suddenly became a bit of a they were shelved in the background, the burner, in terms of not getting productions. There was an instruction quite clearly from the Pentagon and perhaps in the White House as well, of not going on, not moving on with those films. So those are kept at bay. But the question becomes simply that when you watch 9/11 collapse, when you watch the entire Twin Tower collapse, as spectators, as visual consumers, we should have known, we should have seen that this is something we've seen before in Hollywood cinema and Hollywood films. Okay. And then Zizek goes on to say, the fact that the September 11 attacks were the stuff of popular fantasies long before they actually took place provides yet another case of twisted logical dreams. It is easy to account for the fact that poor people around the world dream about becoming Americans. So what do the well-to-do Americans immobilized in their well-being dream about? About a global catastrophe that would shatter their lives. Why? This is what psychoanalysis is about, to explain why, in the midst of well-being, we are haunted by nightmarish visions of catastrophes. So what Zizek is saying, again, this is a very, very psychoanalytical reading of 9/11. He's saying, in a very psychoanalytic, psychological way of looking at 9/11, one could argue, with a certain degree of rationale, that the 9/11 attacks were actually, nightmares of Americans. So when the non-Americans, the quote-unquote third world people, the less privileged people that dream of coming to America, what do the affluent Americans who actually live in America dream about? They dream about this catastrophe. They dream about this spectacular crisis, spectacular violence, which is unleashed with something like the Twin Tower collapse. And this is a nightmare which came true. This is a fantasy which came true, as I just mentioned a while ago. Okay, next, Zizek moves on to page 26. This is a section which we will study in some details. When Zizek reads Apocalypse Now, the very famous Francis Ford Coppola film, and loosely based on the Vietnam War. And it talks about how Apocalypse Now becomes a very important cultural document, a very important cultural text, and also in terms of looking at it from a postmodern perspective. So how so? Apocalypse Now, Francis Ford Coppola's newly edited longer version of Apocalypse Now, the longer version of Apocalypse Now, Redar, stages the coordinates of the structural excess of state power in the clearest possible way. Is it not significant that the figure of Kurtz, the Freudian primordial father, the obscene father enjoyment subordinate to no symbolic law, the total master who dares to confront the real but of terrifying enjoyment face to face, is presented not as a reminder of some barbaric past, but as a necessary outcome of modern Western power itself. So if you read the original book, again, this is loosely based on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness as well, and also the Vietnam War. So Kurtz, the Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now, who is this primordial father, who is this noble savage, the perfect savage, who has perfect enjoyment, perfect libidinal power, libidinal authority, libidinal position. That particular person is not presented as some kind of a barbarian. He's not presented as some kind of a savage in a real sense. But ironically, he's seen as an extension of the perfect product of European Enlightenment, the perfect product of Western training. So he's actually an ex-soldier. He's a perfect soldier, and he's now become a danger because he's too perfect. He becomes monstrous because of his perfection. Right? So in a very Frankensteinian kind of a way, you can do this reading. So this is what Zizek says. He's a necessary outcome of modern Western power itself. Kurtz was a perfect soldier. As such, through his over-identification with the military power system, he turned into the excess which the system has to eliminate. So the excess, the monstrosity comes out of perfection, and that's the paradox in Kurtz. So now he's become a problem. Now it's become an aberration. Now it's become a monster, which the Western power now, the military system now has to eliminate. So it becomes an object of aversion because of its over-identification with the military system. So the primordial libidinal father over here is not really a savage, it's a civilized soldier who's now become too perfect for the system's own good, and therein lies the problem, and hence he needs to be done away with by the system at the moment. So he now becomes an excess, he now becomes a monstrous construct because of its over-identification. So the ultimate horizon of Apocalypse Now is this insight into how power generates its own excess. So this becomes a very important study of power, and how power produces its own excess, how power produces its own monsters, which need to be gotten rid of, which it has to annihilate in an operation that has to imitate what it fights. So Willard's mission to kill Kurtz does not exist in the official record. It never happened, as the general who briefs Willard points out. So this elimination will not be recorded. This elimination of Kurtz, who is a monster born out of an excessive over-identification, that elimination, the murder of Kurtz will not be recorded, will be eliminated even from the records. So we thereby enter the domain of secret operations, of what the power does without even admitting it. So the very interesting surreptitious operation of power. So power works in overt ways as well as covert ways. So this is a covert operation of power. And does not the same go for today's figures presented by the official media as the embodiment of radical evil? Is this not the truth behind the fact that bin Laden and the Taliban emerged as part of a CIA-supported anti-Soviet guerrilla movement in Afghanistan, and behind the fact that the Noriega in Panama was an ex-CIA agent? Is not the USA fighting its own excess in all these cases? And was the same not true already of fascism? The liberal West had to join forces with communism to destroy its own excessive outgrowth. So again, this is a very beautiful way of looking at popular culture and then using popular culture in terms of looking at what happens in real political situations. So use example of Kurtz in Apocalypse Now, who becomes a problem, who becomes a monster because of its over-identification with power, because of its excessive embodiment of power. Not because he's a savage, but because he's too good a soldier, because he's too perfect a soldier. It's become a problem because of his perfection. So it's a monstrosity born out of, or produced out of perfection. And hence he needs to be gotten rid of, he needs to be eliminated now, because it's become a problem. Now, Zizek is drawing parallels between that and what happens to Bin Laden with the Taliban and the US. The Taliban was, emerged as part of a CIA, supported anti-Soviet guerrilla warfare. So when the Cold War was at its peak in Afghanistan, then Bin Laden and the Taliban were actually supported in terms of funding, in terms of military ammunition by the CIA. Which was obviously engaged in a warfare with the KGB, with the Russians at that point in time. Now, obviously, Bin Laden becomes a bit of a Kurtzian kind of figure in terms of his over-identification with that power system, and it then becomes a problem to the USA, which had actually facilitated and produced Bin Laden in the first place as a martial agent. And obviously, the examples to be drawn from other parts of the world as well. He gives example of fascism, which becomes example of excessive outgrowth of the liberal West, which then had to combine forces with communism in order to fight fascism. Okay, so what remains outside the horizon of Apocalypse Now is the perspective of a collective political act breaking out of its vicious cycle of the system, which generates a superego excess and is then compelled to annihilate it. So, Kurtz becomes a superego excess, Bin Laden becomes a superego excess of the system which generated it, and now the system will have to eliminate that excess, eliminate that monster born out of the excess. A revolutionary violence which no longer relies on a superego obscenity. This impossible act is what takes place in every authentic revolutionary process. Right? So this is an impossible act which takes place in a revolutionary process, but what Zizek is saying over here is that, we can constantly draw parallels between popular culture, between, what happens in cinema, what happens in the virtual world, and what happens in the real world in terms of reflecting each other. So again, we're looking at popular culture as not something outside of discourse, it's very much at the heart of discourse, and we just saw a little while ago where Zizek said, he documented the fact that post 9/11, Hollywood became the ISA, the ideological state apparatus for American foreign policies to a large extent, where Hollywood studios were instructed, advised, and funded to a great extent by Pentagon and the White House to make films which had the content, had the message of fight against or war against terrorism. Then it obviously became a classic example of ISA of the American foreign policy. So again, we're looking at a very interesting collusion between the entertainment industry and the political propaganda, which then becomes quite collusive in its quality. So I'll stop with this point in this particular lecture. Thank you for your attention.